Howdy, everyone. Welcome to the next session. I want to introduce to you Ian Smith. This is a man who has stood up to tyrants in his state. You know I love that. They tried to shut down his gym. They tried to shut down his employees and tried to shut down him, but he wasn't having any of it, and he stood right back up. And his story inspired a lot of people, even in Texas, to not shut their businesses. So he has a wide national effect. He's also very knowledgeable about globalism and the effects of globalism on masculinity and the family. And he sports an Odin beard worthy of any frost giant killer.
Good afternoon. I am very happy to be here for my second year at the 21 convention. Last year, I spoke amidst the COVID quote-unquote crisis and in the middle of a very nasty and lengthy battle with the entire state government of New Jersey. I gained notoriety 2.5 years ago on the national stage because somebody came along into my life and told me that I wasn't allowed to provide for my family. I wasn't allowed to do my service, which I'm extremely passionate about, to the community, and basically told me that everything that I hold of value and all value that I can provide was no longer needed, wasn't necessary. My business partner and I decided that we were going to reopen our gym, and well, I guess the rest is history. And I've come today to share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way. What we did 2.5 years ago was probably one of the most proud moments of my life, one of the biggest accomplishments that I've ever had as a young man. However, before I tell you about that, before I tell you about the lessons I've learned, I'd like to also tell you about my greatest failures as a man and my darkest moments as a man. Because this isn't a highlight reel, and I'm by no means a perfect man. In fact, far from it. But I am a trying man, and I am a growing man. And I think that that's an important thing for all of us to remember today. And I hope that after I tell you the stories of how I wound up here, that I can leave you with a lesson or two and maybe answer some questions for you about masculinity and what it looks like in today's modern world. And it's a question that I only began to ask and be asked 2.5 years ago when I decided that I wasn't going to close my gym. So, once again, my name is Ian Smith. Pretty regular childhood. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was raised by a single mother who did her absolute best to raise me well. She did a pretty good job, but I think as all of us here in the crowd and everybody watching understands that you can't raise a man being a woman, that there's something else missing. As I was growing up, I always looked around for some sort of example, how to be a man. And I started to form my identity. And I decided that I wanted to be tough. But I didn't know what that meant. I decided that I wanted to be strong. I didn't know what that meant. I decided that I was opinionated and that I had strong beliefs, but I didn't know how to express them. So as a young teenager, I grew wild, I grew restless, and reckless. When I was in college, 20 years old, I was a hard partier, had no respect for anybody, authority, good or bad. I didn't really have a set of values, only what served me best in that moment. I was good at getting what I wanted, and that usually meant stepping over or on people to do so. Something I'm not proud of. Always got my way one way or another, and it eventually wound me up in a lot of trouble. In April of 2007, I woke after a night, a very typical night at college. I didn't leave the campus that night. It looked like any other normal college night for a kid who lives on campus. 20 years old, having everything paid for them, student loans, barely focusing on school, doing the bare minimum to get by, trying to make the most of that time there. Drank in excess. What was considered normal for me was definitely in excess looking back at it. And I went to sleep that night. The next morning I awoke in a hurry, late to work, didn't really have a real job. Was doing something for my parents. Woke up with about a half hour to get there, and it took about an hour to get there. So woke up in a rush. It was the end of the school year, so I threw some stuff into my car. I got in it, and I just started barreling towards my destination. About 20 minutes later, I became the sole reason for an automobile accident in which took the life of a 20-year-old man. Barreled through a stop sign going well in excess of the speed limit, well in excess of what was posted, and well in excess of what was even reasonable. Why? Because I was a selfish asshole and I didn't really care about anybody else in the world around me. I just needed to get to where I was going. Blew a stop sign and T-boned that young man. He was dead on sight. I remember the accident very vividly, and it's probably something I'll never forget. I came to after the collision and didn't really know what happened. I still remember the song that was playing on the radio. It was skipping. And I was looking around, and there was a big gash across my forehead, and the first thing that led me to realize something was terribly wrong was blood dripping down over my eyes so that I couldn't see. And I ran my tongue across the front of my mouth, felt several teeth missing, and in that moment I realized that it was serious. Hopped out of the car and ran over to the other vehicle. What I saw was the worst thing that I've ever done. Saw a young man trapped in a vehicle that had collapsed on him with absolutely no chance of helping him. Fast forward, went to the hospital. For some reason or another, I sustained minor injuries, a couple missing teeth, a lot of glass in my forehead, but I was otherwise okay. Still smelled like alcohol, because I had drank so much the night before that it was pouring out of my pores, and there was still alcohol present in my system. So not only did I do something terrible and make a huge mistake, I looked like a genuine piece of shit in the process. 9 o'clock in the morning, and I still had a above the legal limit blood alcohol level. The next weeks go by, and trying to deal with this. Feeling bad for myself, asking why. How did this happen? How did I not see it coming? Why didn't I just roll over and go back to bed that night or that morning? And the only way I can describe how I felt in those couple weeks afterwards, my phone would ring and it wouldn't even elicit a response. I wouldn't even look to see who was calling. I was just there, trapped in my head, reliving those moments, and being in a place of hopelessness and hatred for oneself. My mom came up with the idea, she's a public school teacher, or was, that I should speak about what happened. And I didn't want to do it, but being the selfish asshole that I was at the time, she said, you know what, it might look good for your sentencing. So I said, okay. I went, they put me up in an auditorium full of 500 kids. Had no idea what I was going to say. I just got up there and I told my story. And afterwards, the principal of the school came up to me and he said, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen an auditorium full of high schoolers dead quiet. I've done auditoriums for years and years and years. I've done presentations for years and years and years for these kids. And he said, you captivated them. Do you mind if I give your number to some of my colleagues? I said, sure. Wound up speaking at 25 schools before I was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. And right before I was sentenced, it's a very strange feeling when you know you're going away. There's this sort of ticking clock over your head. Feels like very hard to stay motivated, to stay focused, to even give a shit. You know, I had already felt bad enough about what I did, and now it kind of seemed like my life was over too. 20 years old, facing down 10 years in prison for what was totally something that I never meant to do, that was an accident, that if I could change places with that young man, I would. Didn't matter though. Justice had to be served. And a couple weeks before I went away, never slept very well. I would sleep a couple hours a night no matter what I did. I'd always relive that scene of getting out of my vehicle, walking up to the other vehicle and seeing a young man trapped, dead. I went into the mirror, excuse me, I went into the bathroom, and it was wee hours of the morning, and I remember kind of having a moment where I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and I was still pretty banged up. I looked like Two-Face, kind of from Batman. I had hit the windshield with one side of my face, so I had all these scars and cuts all over it, and I was missing teeth on this side, but pretty normal looking on the other side. And I looked at myself, and I actually started to laugh because I thought, look at you, you fool. Look at what you've done. Look at what your arrogance and your selfishness and your lack of concern has done. You thought you were tough. You thought you could handle the world by yourself. You thought you had all the answers. You thought you were invincible. Now you have nothing. Your life will go nowhere. And you look like a fool. In that moment, I remember thinking to myself, what now? Where do I go from here? What do I do? How do I make this better? Can I make this better? Should I even try? And I sat there looking at myself for a while, and I came to the conclusion that not only should I change my life, I had a responsibility and a duty to do so. I had a responsibility to the young man who was killed because of my recklessness and carelessness. And if I didn't strive to be a better man, and if I didn't strive to somehow repent from my sins, that would be an insult to the young man who passed away and an insult to his family and to everybody that I hurt by doing what I did. So I resolved then and there that I would figure it out. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't even know who I wanted to become, what my values were, or how to get there. Fast forward, 21 years old, the gavel bangs, and I'm sentenced to 5.5 years in state prison. I don't remember a whole lot that day, a lot of crying. It's kind of like being at your own funeral. You're surrounded by family, and nobody really knows what to say. It's not a whole lot to say. People are just trying to be there for you. And before my sentencing, a family member of the young man who passed away came up to me outside of the courtroom and said to me, "Are you Ian?" I said, "Yes." She handed me a card, and she walked away. I opened up that card, and in it just said, "We don't hate you. We hate what you did." And I remember feeling a huge weight lifted off of my shoulders, because that was forgiveness like I've never experienced. And I felt an even greater sense of responsibility moving forward, because somebody had given me that gift. That probably wasn't very easy for that person to write and to say. So the gavel bangs. I hear my mom scream as I'm sort of ripped away from her, and off I go. 21 years old, kid from the suburbs who's pretended like he was tough his whole life, but really wasn't. Getting thrown in with the big dogs in one of the roughest county jails in Jersey, and that's never fun. You go in and you might get 2 shoes. One's probably the wrong size. Your pants are probably 3 times too big, and they're still wet from whatever laundry the prison offers. And you're kind of sent into this holding area, and I was just trying to take it all in. And I remember sitting there a couple days in, and it was actually a weekend. And I had made a friend in this older gentleman who was getting ready to serve 18 years. And I remember we were playing cards, and I was like, man, that week went pretty quick. Like, that wasn't too bad. And then I started to compute how many more weeks I had to do. And I remember feeling like the walls were closing in, and I couldn't breathe, and I started to just absolutely panic because it was hundreds compared to that one. So I was shipped off eventually to state prison, and the first year was about learning how to survive. Prisons are little micro societies. They all operate a little bit differently depending on the demographic and who's in it, and what the ratio of groups are in there. And that was my first experience with tribalism. I had never experienced it. I wasn't in a fraternity in college. I wasn't on sports teams or anything growing up. I didn't have that bond between men where you're willing to go to really, really far extents to protect each other and to make sure that not only are you okay, but that you're thriving as well. And I remember watching it all, watching the way different groups, gangs, races, religions, whatever way they were divided, how they would interact amongst each other and with each other. And I studied, and I just watched and watched and watched and watched. And eventually, after many mistakes, annoying correctional officers was one. I didn't have a pillow, and I kept asking this guy for a fucking pillow. And eventually, I wound up just with a knife under my mattress and in solitary confinement instead. Because nobody gives a shit about your comfort. Nobody gives a shit whether you're happy. You've been stripped of everything. And in order to have anything, you have to gain respect first. You start at the bottom in prison. And it took a while for me to understand that I was at the bottom because I was used to living a somewhat comfortable life. I lived middle-class life. I never really had to struggle that hard. I never really wanted anything that bad. I was never really deprived of anything to the point of discomfort and hunger and all of these feelings that I've never really felt before. Feeling alone, feeling desperate, feeling completely powerless. Being told when you're going to eat, what you're going to eat, how much you're going to eat, when you sleep, when you wake up, when the lights turn on, when the lights turn off, where you can go, who you can be around with, what you dress like, what type of materials you can read, what type of television you can watch, what type of communication you can have with the outside world. You don't get anything. You have to earn all of it. So, about a year in, sort of figured my way through things, and I was approached many times to join these different groups, and I just kept saying no, kept saying no, kept saying no. Eventually, I ran into a little bit of trouble with this particular group and wound up in a little bit of a scuffle, And because of that, I wound up in solitary confinement. Not a fun time. When you don't know who you are, being alone is a very scary thing. Very, very scary thing. Being alone and being unable to be distracted was one of the scariest things I've ever had to face down. Because I was 22 years old, and I knew nothing about myself. I didn't know what my fears were. I didn't know what my dreams were. I didn't know what my values were. And everything that I thought I was just sort of a projection. There was not a whole lot of substance to it. I may have said things and acted certain ways, but I never lived any of these things. And I remember how loud the silence was and how intimidating it was. But I'm actually very thankful and grateful for the opportunity, because I had to sit with myself for weeks with no contact, nothing to do. You're in a cell 24 hours a day. You might come out to make a phone call every 3 days for about 15 minutes. But other than that, it's 24 hours a day, just you and your thoughts. And eventually, I started to use the time well. At first, I would just try to sleep because I was trying to be distracted and I was trying to escape. Because there was all these nagging questions that I could hear, that I didn't want to answer, that I didn't want to address, or that I was too scared to even think about. And eventually, I got myself a pen and a paper, and I started to write some things down. I started to answer some of these questions, and I took the time to figure out what I wanted to be, what I wanted to do, and the mark that I wanted to leave on the world.